So, welcome everybody. We have a great speech here. Not by me, I'm Severi Uusitalo, Industrial Design Associate Professor at Department of Design at Aalto Arts. But we have here, more importantly, Professor John Gero, a design scientist. He has been a visiting professor of architecture, artificial intelligence, civil engineering, cognitive science, computer science, design and computation, and mechanical engineering at MIT, UC Berkeley, UCLA, Columbia, CMU, as well as others in UK, France, and Switzerland. His research covers design theory, design computing, design cognition, and design neurocognition. He is currently a research professor in computer science and architecture in University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Well, firstly, it's a pleasure to be back at Aalto, and Finland has just done the right thing. The weather is beautiful. I've been told to bring cold weather clothing, and I haven't been using it. So what I want to talk about today is what happens in the minds of designers. Now, there's a bit of a problem here because the mind is rather hard to gain access to. And that's part of what we're going to talk about. But talking about design is not new, although because designing has been around for a very long time. If you go back to the earliest writings, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is over 4,000 years ago, you will see writing about the process of designing, how to build. Actually, they're talking about how to build a boat, which may or may not be the ark. Then about 300 or 400 years later, but still a long time ago, the king Hammurabi produced a very detailed code that encapsulated the social life of the times. And in there was a very interesting piece. It says if you design and build a house for a person, and that house collapses and kills the owner of the house, you will be put to death. Who knew designing was such a dangerous act? But that was the social view of designing. The Romans, of course, who wrote about everything, building on the Greeks, Vitruvius wrote about architecture. Architecture then meant everything that was designed, and introduced the idea that there were criteria for the things you design. And this was being followed all the way through to today. But it wasn't until roughly 1,500 years later that the notion that the designer plays a role was introduced. And this was Alberti. What I want to do is to say, although talking about designing has been around for a long time, the notion of measuring it is new. And that's what I want to talk about. And the field has a new name, or has a name which is a made-up word, because it's drawn from cognitive science. Cognitive science is that idea that you can make statements about the mind, the way the mind works, the structures in the mind, without seeing, feeling, or touching the mind. And that field is cognitometrics, measuring the mind. How can you do this? How can you measure something you cannot see, feel, or touch? It shouldn't be that difficult to understand because you can't see, feel, or touch the signals that come to and emanate from your phone. Yet we can measure them and we make use of them. So conceptually, it's the same idea with some subtle differences. it has to do with the only way we can gain access to the mind is when you externalize thought. If you don't externalize it, we can't see it. And what are the ways you externalize thought? The most common way is what I'm doing now, which is verbalization. Presumably what I'm saying reflects in some way what I'm thinking. But there's other ways, like I just use my hands, although I don't think these gestures actually mean very much. But gestures, and then sketching, and other forms of externalization. And then, of course, there's things we don't control, like where our eyes look, our heart rate, and things like that, which are autonomous responses. The point about that is there's lots of externalization. What I want to deal with is primarily verbalization. But before we get to that, you notice the first on my list was behavior. We don't need to even listen to you, we just watch what you do. And I want to give you an example of that first. And the example is, how do we measure fixation in design? What is fixation? Fixation is when you're exposed to a stimulus. In design, that's generally a drawing, a sketch, and you inappropriately get stuck on ideas that are in that sketch. And it's the inappropriate part of it. Now, this is a serious issue because that's how we teach design. We show you things. So here's a nice experiment that looks like this. Here's a verbal design prompt, design something. And we give that to one group. And a second group, we give exactly the same design prompt, but we show them a sketch, and we say, we show you this so you get some idea of the level of detail we're looking for. It so happens the sketch has three things about it that intentionally, some good ideas, some ideas that don't work, and some irrelevant ideas. And those are the things we're going to measure. So, here's mechanical engineers, and don't get too wound up in trying to read the detail, but the thing to see here is that on the left are the people who don't see the sketch, and these are some of the parameters, variables that are in the sketch, and you'll see that the control group doesn't have most of them. And then the group that's shown the image, they have a lot of them. We see fixation. It's really interesting, however, architects, by the way, look like this too, but industrial designers don't. Industrial designers look different. And I'm going to leave that there, not on the screen, the idea. So, let's move on to this notion of how you get data, information, from verbalization. And that's called protocol analysis. It's been around for 50-odd years, but it's only recently has been developed into a much more sophisticated measuring tool. And this is what it looks like. On the left are frames from videos of people verbalizing while they design. The top two are students. The bottom left is an industrial group doing some innovation. That's what they're tasked with. And the bottom right is remote designing. And the way it works, and you don't need to get too serious about this here, we video people, we transcribe their verbalization, and then we segment and code. And this idea of coding is a critical notion. So instead of using all the words in the English or Finnish language, we categorize them. And what we end up with is a sequence of these codes. which is an abstraction of the words, and we analyze them and do things with them. So, one way to code is to say, are they talking about the solution or the problem? And we can now look across a design session or multiple design sessions and see where they spend their time. And something that you see pretty much everywhere, which is contrary to theory, is they start with the solution. As soon as they read what the requirements are, they put some ideas down. Interestingly enough, designers will put ideas down before they read this, which is very odd, right? They just have some ideas. They just want to get them out. A richer coding, not just problem and solution, is to break the world up, the world of design ideas, into a very simple set of categories. The first is function. What do I mean by function? What is the purpose of this thing? Right? It might be something like improve market share. Might be something like keep babies safe. These are intentions that you want for the thing you're designing. The second category is behavior. The thing you design, how does it work? What does it do in that sense? And the thing you design we call structure. Function, behavior, structure. And this is an ontology, and if you don't know what an ontology is, look it up in a modern dictionary. And we use this to code. So that's what I'm going to show you, the sort of measurements you can make by listening to people designing, categorizing their words into these categories, and using this to understand and compare. So here, for example, is if you're using two different methods to come up with ideas, brainstorming and morphological analysis. If you don't know what morphological analysis is, just say it's a different method. And what we can see here is that we can measure the differences in design cognition, the structure of the concepts that you're using in your mind. We can measure and work out the distinctions between what you're doing here. So we can see here, and let's not get, again, too wound up with what the specific results are. We can look at whether you, as a professor, whether when we try and educate you, does that make a difference? Or do you just makes no difference at all, you're just spending your time here until you go out, which is quite possible. But here, we can show that you change due to education. So what is this the result of? We get you to do some designs when you enter in the first semester of your first year. And this happens to be engineering students who haven't declared their major, that is, which area they're going to specialize in. And there's two groups now, people who do mechanical engineering design and people who do engineering mechanics. And what this measures is the change over 3 years of how you distribute your effort when you design. And not unexpectedly, we get these kinds of results. So for example, if you look at the second set of bars there, you'll see that people doing design increase the amount of effort they put into talking about function. What is this stuff for? And if you look at the fourth group of bars, the people who are doing mechanics do a lot more work on how does this thing behave. But we can measure this, and we can tell you where these changes take place. It's always interesting to see what happens between different domains of designing. So this is the result of studying three teams. The first team on the left are industrial designers, on the right are mechanical engineers, and in the middle are mixed teams. And what are we measuring? We're measuring the ratio of effort, cognitive effort, put into thinking about the problem over the cognitive effort of thinking about the solution. And so it's called the problem solution index. And we can see that for this task, which is a task where people pretty much understand what it is, it's about a coffee maker, that's what the CM stands for. Industrial designers put more effort than mechanical engineers into thinking about the problem. And we give the same people a different kind of task. A task where people don't know what the answer might even look like. What does the design look like? And this is for a future personal entertainment system. And look at what happens. Mechanical engineers don't change their behavior. And industrial designers change their behavior dramatically. They increase the amount of time and effort they put into thinking about the problem. Now you can draw conclusions from this, and I'll leave you to draw those conclusions. So we can take this coding scheme and look at things in more detail. So this is again looking at industrial designers and mechanical engineers, but now we're looking at studio crits. When you're in a studio and you're working with a tutor back and forth, what is the difference between mechanical engineers and industrial designers? And again, we can measure this. The critical idea is measurement. And these results, it doesn't matter who does this, they get these results. Now, when people are interacting, they're passing information back and forth. This is not knowledge or data. This is information. Information is a more abstract idea. And this is sped up. These people aren't actually working this fast. And you can see that little worm down the bottom, that blue, and it's measuring entropy. And what is entropy here? Entropy has to do with the unused capacity of what you're doing. So that would be the potential of the ideas that you've generated. The higher up it goes, the more potential in the ideas that you've generated, and the lower, the less. So it's sort of a measure of divergence and convergence, although it's actually more than that. And we can take that and examine what happens. And if you look at this, you'll see somewhere just past the middle, it really dips down. And in fact, the entropy goes to zero. It says there's no potential there. That's a measure of fixation, where you're stuck. It's this spot there. So we can do behavioral measures of fixation, as we saw right at the outset, or we can actually do these more detailed cognitive studies based on what you're saying as opposed to what you're doing. It's always interesting to see what is the difference between novices and experts. And I'm going to show you something that I don't want you to try and read. I want you to look at it. And you'll see in a minute why. This is what I'm going to show you. It's not for reading. What I want you to see in this is the last and the second last column, look at how many entries there are in each of those columns. Each entry refers to an individual idea, or in cognitive terms, it's called a chunk. And people have shown, cognitive scientists have shown, that the human ability to engage with multiple chunks at the same time is limited. Your short-term memory is limited to somewhere between 5 and 8 independent chunks. The right-hand column is the number of chunks an expert is working with. And the second most right column is the number of chunks a novice, which is a student in this case, and the other's a professional designer. And you'll see that it's way above their short-term memory capacity, which means they are overloaded. And when you look at the time they take to make decisions and what they do with them is materially different. And this is the explanation, that novices overload their capacity and experts don't. Although there's a really interesting side result. Novices have their ideas rated as being more creative than experts. But they don't know they're creative. Another thing not to read carefully, but to look at the colors of those lines. So what are we showing here? This is teams of 2, which are either both male or one is male and the other is female. And the gray things are models of the people. And those lines refer to interactions between cognitive categories of a kind we talked about earlier. And the brighter they are, the more interactions there is. And I don't know how well you can see, but on the right you should see red compared to yellow, which means a lot more activity, and there's more lines connecting the two. What this shows is that if you have a mixed gender team, you actually have more collaboration than if we haven't done female-female teams. This is done with a group of engineers, and it's really quite hard to get a lot of females doing engineering. And this is the same kind of result. Again, the thing to look at here is what is the distribution that this shows. The things we're looking at here are when females talk to each other, when males talk to each other, and when males and females talk to each other. And we can see they are distributed on this plane, and if they're not in the same quadrant, it means they're different. And there are big differences. So whether we like it or not, gender plays quite a big role in the way in which members of design teams interact with each other. And talking about design teams, this is a model of a team of 7 people in an industrial organization doing their goal in this particular case is a really interesting design task. The design task is this. We own a lot of intellectual property. We have a lot of patents. Currently, we work for very large organizations. Can you design a consumer product using our patents? That's it. What we have here is a lot of information about the interaction between team members. The size of the circle is the number of words the person uttered. You don't need to be smart. Alan is the team leader, and he talks the most. And Rodney, these are not their real names, Rodney is the intern, talks the least. The person who talks the least in the team who's not an intern is Sandra, who's female. Now, the links between them represents the fraction of their time they talk to other people or themselves. When I say talked, I mean in relation to their own ideas. And I've highlighted in a solid blue which is the highest of all the interactions of ideas. And look what you see. For everybody, including the intern, the ideas they interact with most are their own, not other people's, until you get near the end of a design session where you're now narrowing down to very specific decisions. And this is different to turn-taking. It doesn't correlate with turn-taking at all. Now, often you hear people talk about design spaces, the space of ideas that people are working within, and they generally mean this in some sort of metaphorical sense. They don't actually mean a real space. But I'm going to suggest there is such a thing as a real space. By real, I mean in memory, and that you can measure it. Now, designers, I would suggest, construct the world they work in. It's not sitting there and they sort of go and inhabit it. They actually construct in their minds a world and work within that. So when you do it, or when you do it, they're different, even when you interact. How can you characterize anything about something like that? Every word that you utter, and I'm going to restrict it initially to nouns, refers to an idea. Nouns are labels for ideas. The first time you utter a particular, an individual noun, that starts to construct the space of ideas you're working with. So if we call the first time you utter the word a first occurrence, it turns out, if you look inside people's brains, that's distinguishable from all the other uses every time you utter the word again. And by distinguishable, I mean statistically. That's amazing that you could make that statement. Because now we can start using first occurrence as a basis for measuring things. So here's a study. This one was in Israel, it so happens, where we're looking at studio design crits, some of which are carried out in immersive environments, immersive virtual environments, and some are carried out on desktop computers. In fact, it's the same people, the same tutors. And what we're measuring here is who has first occurrences and what's the relative amount of first occurrences. And each one of these bars is one student. On the left are non-immersive crits, desktop crits, and you can see that the bars from the tutor, which is the grey bars, dominate. But when you go to immersive VR, there's a fundamental shift. And therefore we claim that immersive VR engages students more because they introduce more ideas. It's not dominated by the tutor. Here's another thing. Again, I'm trying to suggest that we can measure what happens in the minds of designers. If you remember, we could categorize what they're talking about into function, behavior, and structure. And this is looking at the utterances about structure across time. On the left is industrial designers, on the right, mechanical engineers. And every time they utter it, we add a unit. So this is a cumulative graph. And it surprisingly, although it's wavy, it's pretty linear. And I don't think anyone ever knew that before. That designers actually talk about structure, whether they're designing, or in this case it's a crit, pretty uniformly. Because theory says in the beginning you talk about the problem, then you stop talking about the problem and work on the solution. But it turns out that's not what people do. Doesn't matter what the theory is. And it doesn't matter what you're taught. And we see the same in professionals across multiple disciplines. Measurement gives you sort of objective results which theory doesn't, and this kind of theory. So let me introduce another idea that people talk about, coevolution. In the natural world, we know what evolution is. It's the interaction of organisms through the exchange of genetic material. Nicely established. And coevolution is the interaction of organisms without the exchange of genetic material. Right? And there's nice examples of this. There's islands off the coast of Africa where there's not enough food for elephants. So what happens? Elephants evolve to be smaller. But they don't exchange anything with what they eat in terms of genetic material. We can take this as an analogy for designing. Design evolution is interaction between people, designers, through the exchange and incorporation of ideas. So you have an idea, I take it and work on it. Maybe I have an idea, you take it and work on it. So we're exchanging ideas. Coevolution is the interaction without exchanging ideas, where an idea you have prompts an idea for me, but I don't take your idea. And my idea prompts an idea back. So that's the notion. And this is 3 designers in a team. The horizontal axis is sort of time, and the vertical axis is accumulation of first occurrences. And the lines between them are when one has an idea, the other person produces a new idea based on something to do with that, and the first person produces another idea, new idea, based on what the second person did. You have to think about it. And what's interesting about this is these 3 are 3 members of a design team, and X and Z or Z produce the most new ideas, and it looks like Y doesn't do much, not many new ideas. But when you look at the coevolution of ideas, Y plays a very important role because they prompt new ideas in X and Z. When you look at a video of this team, you can't see this at all. If you have teams made up of different domains, do they really collaborate? So what is this? This is the design space. That is, it's every single idea that 57 designers who are working on the same thing had. Every single idea. And you can see that some of the labels are bigger than others. That's when multiple designers had the same idea. So the more of those, the bigger they are, the more they had. The ones around the edge, only one person had. But what I want to show here is the color. Mechanical engineers are pink and electrical engineers are blue. And you don't have to do measurements to see they're not interacting that much. They're mainly working within their own domain. They do interact, but nowhere near the way you might think, particularly if you're listening and just doing, one person talks and the next person talks. So if a mechanical engineer talks and an electrical engineer talks, they must be talking to each other about ideas. And we can look over time how these first occurrences come into being. So on the right, the vertical axis is time, and the colors represent 3 individual team members. And the closer they are to the center, the more those ideas reoccur. And we can see that blue's ideas dominate compared to, say, red. Again, I think it's not possible to sit in a design session listening to designers and find this, but we can measure it. Now, I mentioned function, behavior, structure, and it turns out that if you look inside the brain of designers, we find that those categorical ideas, those ideas about function, behavior, and structure, which we claim are quite separate, no overlap, when we look inside the brain, they're in different places. These are very preliminary results, and I wouldn't want to bet my life on them, but it looks like that's the case. So, I want to sort of wrap this up. Where does this kind of research fit into design thinking research? And I'm going to suggest there's a nice framework that looks like this. There's 3 fundamental ways in which you can study the mind, at least in design thinking. One is design cognition, which is what we've been talking about. And in design cognition, there's sort of 3 ways you can do it. One is sort of surveys. And surveys are fantastic, but not very robust. Right? What do I mean by that? I can get the answers I'm looking for by asking the questions in the right way. Right? Do you like Aalto University? And does it give you a good education? I don't ask those questions. I ask questions that force you to give the answer yes if I was to ask those questions. So there's a whole way of trying to make sure that the questions don't bias the answers. But that's hard. The second of these behavioral studies, or black box experiments, of the fixation kind that I mentioned very early on. Input, designer, output. Change the input, you get a change in output. Presumably that's because the designer did something. So we can now find out about what's happening in something about the mind of the designer by doing that kind of black box experiment. And the third kind are these protocol studies, as they're called, protocol analysis, which are largely predicated on the notion that verbalization is an externalization of thought. And we've been able to use that idea to produce the sort of results I've talked about. What I haven't talked about today is you have a body. You can't get rid of it. Well, you can, you die, but the mind goes with it as well. And the body responds to what you're doing and what is happening to you. And you can measure those. And most of those things are autonomous. That is, you don't control them. And they're actually quite easy to measure. And then there's the brain. And that used to be very difficult to measure what was happening in the brain. And today it's not. You can buy a device, and I've mentioned 3 basic methods there. EEG, which measures electrical signals that escape through the skull due to bundles of neurons firing. And you can buy a device for $895 US. I have no idea what that is. In euros, $870. That's really not much. And you can do reasonable work on it. You can pay a lot more. The second, FNI, is functional near-infrared spectroscopy, looks inside your brain. It shines an infrared light in, measures the reflection, and they're a bit more expensive, $50,000. And the ones people have heard about most is fMRI, functional magnetoresonance imaging. They're the big tubes that you lie down in and slide into it, and it measures things in your brain activity. And we now are in a position to do all of these in design thinking research and bring these results from these 3 together, triangulate them, and use them to help us understand what this foundational activity that humans carry out looks like. Okay. And that's where I want to finish. What I want you to go away with, and it would be nice if you did, is that there's something going on here. That we're able now to do something we weren't able to do before. And that the kinds of results we're starting to generate will inform us both as students of design, education institutions even, but educators of designers and practitioners. There's still a gap. You can't just put someone in, a headset on someone and say, this is it. But we can begin to do that. And I'm going to finish with one little statement. If I show you while you're designing your brain and show which parts of your brain are highly activated while you're coming up with ideas, you will produce more ideas. Not just 1 or 2 more, you will double the rate at which your idea production occurs. It's called neurocognitive feedback. And so far, we've looked at 100 people, designers, all of them exhibit this. So it turns out we can change you, not just through education. Hopefully that's a positive change, that you have more ideas. But we can do this. So this isn't just academic research. It has the potential to change what happens in the future. And let me stop there.
Thank you, John. Any questions? I have some. Okay, let's ensure that the audience gets a chance. There's a lady with the white shirt on the right.
Yes, the one looking around. That's always the criterion. Yes.
Thank you. Really inspiring lecture. Thank you. I read that there was research that is explaining in a similar way. It wasn't about creative design thinking, but it was rather about the way we think, how the thoughts that we produce actually end up changing our brain. And it was claiming that, if I understood it correctly, which I do think that I did, that if you have negative thoughts or very pessimistic thoughts, they will actually change permanently the brain structure. And if you would have been thinking more positive thoughts, then the outcome or the something what happens to your brain structure would be then either remaining in the normal level if you have positive thoughts, and or else then it'll improve it. But do you have anything to say about that? Because I think that is all what we know about those who play the piano, those who do some creative work, that they, exactly like you say, they actually do end up increasing or producing more positive brain cell structure. Can you say something about that, about the quality of those thoughts?
I have done no research on what your mood does, and other people have. But what I can say is not the brain structure, so I'm being a bit pedantic here, but the way in which, let's say, parts of the brain are connected, because they're always connected, but the strength of connection changes by what you think. So if I put it at one extreme, if you don't think at all, these connections are very loose and some of them don't even occur. But if you, for example, are good, and I don't know how you get to be good at this naturally, at connecting distant ideas, that changes the strength of the connections in different parts of your brain, and it makes it easier for you to have distant ideas connected. So I'm not sure I'd call that changing the structure of the brain in a strict sense, but it changes the behavior of the brain, right? And certainly studies have shown that people who change their behavior, for example, through music, through drugs. Actually, drugs not. Interestingly enough, the studies on drugs and creativity have a very interesting outcome, They do not improve creativity, but they do change your claim about creativity. Right? You think you're much more creative when in fact you're not. So yes, there is something to what you've said, more than something, and I don't think it's been studied in design.
Thank you. Any other questions? Maybe from the back there, to make the mic run longer.
Very interesting lecture. Thanks, John. This way of measuring and categorizing group interactions, has it been done on other activities outside of design? I think you were mentioning about other sort of work activities, but also beyond, perhaps more into sort of group social interactions as well. And I'm wondering if it has, where the patterns you were identifying, behaviors, some surprising, some not, whether that changes much based on perhaps working activities, but also again on social activities.
Okay. Again, I have not done that work, but I can tell you about work related to that. There's a lot of work done in military team sessions where there's something more articulated there, which is how many stars or stripes are on your uniform, right? So we know what the formal structure is. A general outranks a colonel, outranks a captain, and so on. There's also, and now they also do gender studies because women are now in the military. And what they study first is, where are you looking, right? And there's a correlation between whether you're looking at the speaker and what you do with what they say. So that's something we haven't done, but I've seen multiple military studies of that kind. What you get, and we have done these kinds of studies, is there's a de jure structure, that is the formal structure in a team, and then there's the structure that is developed by the interactions. Right? So you might be the team leader, and you might be some lowly intern, and it doesn't follow that you're going to be the leader just because you're listed as the team leader. What we find is we get subgroups or sub-teams forming, which we sort of saw in that blue slide, where two people interacted with each other. Right? And that's how a sub-team is formed. And we can track that over time. And we can track that over what it is they're doing. Right? So maybe there's this sub-team that's really good at coming up with ideas, but they're no good at working out whether things are going to actually work. Analyzing. Another sub-team might do that. And they might change. So, and it's interesting when you look at these kinds of behaviors, you can correlate sub-team generation endogenously. Endogenous is a nice word, just means internally. No one's making it happen. With the performance of the design they generate. So it's interesting. Sub-teams that are highly specialized, when you compare sub-teams that different members move into different sub-teams, perform really differently. Those that are generalized actually have a wider variety of ideas than specialists, which is interesting because we really work hard to get specialists onto our teams. So these are the sorts of things we're now starting to find with these kinds of research methods. Doesn't fully answer your question, but in that direction.
It's interesting, yes, thank you. So, actually, sorry, just one follow-up. On the slide you had where you showed linear references to design, and you were saying under theory you weren't expecting it to be a sort of a linear occurrence. I just wondered if you have a theory around why it is linear when that wasn't what was expected from the original theory.
I do, but I'm going to get you to wait until I finish the paper.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you.
All right, so there is Christian at least. Yes.
Right. Thank you so much again for that really, really fascinating overview. You've been, amongst others, also talking about how your research sheds more light on how our education about design influences how designers think. I'm wondering, what about vice versa? How can your findings inform our education in order to then, again, impact how designers think? And I'm especially thinking about how have they changed your thought about some of the most popular process models of design that we have nowadays, for instance, the double diamond model, that really nicely distinguishes problem and solution and convergent and divergent thinking. It's a bit related to this question over here, and maybe you refer me to the upcoming paper, and it's totally fine. But
this one I'm happy to talk about further. Firstly, it's unclear to me what is driving a lot of design education. Right? I don't see when I actually, last time I came here, I read what Aalto said it was trying to do as much as I could off the web. And I thought, that's the outcome. Right? I couldn't find anything about how they would get to that outcome. Now, I'm not picking on Aalto, actually I am, but
Thank you.
you know, I'm sure it's the same everywhere, right? It's very much outcome oriented. But let's say it wasn't. Let's say they said, we're going to teach you, there's a book called by Pal and Bites. If you're in mechanical engineering, it's the Bible in Europe, not in America. And it's called, what is it called? The Rational Theory of Design or something like that. And it says things exactly the way you would expect. Talk to the client, get the requirements fully sorted out before you start. Right there's a problem. It's not possible if you're trying to do design that isn't well understood, the thing you're designing, to get all the requirements. Because that means you're going to be working within a space that everyone already is working in. So right there, it tells me, and if I'm an educator, I wouldn't tell students, don't start till you have everything. We know they don't do that, and professionals don't do it either. They start immediately putting stuff down. And in fact, they'll put stuff down before they read the requirements. They'll have some general, obviously if, BMW is talking to you, you're going to be doing something about cars, and they'll already have stuff, which is fascinating. So we study people's brains while they're reading the requirements. And you can tell you a lot about that. So now let's come back. What do you want your students to get out of their education? And if you answer that, then I will respond. Right? I'm not asking here. I'm asking generally. I think the purpose of the models that we give our students is not for them to follow them, which is sort of what students often think it is. It's to show them that you can structure things. And you don't have to structure it that way. If you remember, there was a slide about brainstorming and morphological analysis. those, was there?
There was.
There was, just that I gave something this morning as well. And they were the responses, the cognitive responses, that is the thinking that you did, they evoked quite different responses. And that tells you two things. Firstly, it matters what you teach people, which is fantastically important if you're a professor and want the world to continue for you. But more importantly, it turns out it matters for the student because it affects what they do. People think brainstorming is this great thing, and it's one of many ways of thinking. And as a pedagogy, it's very limited. That is, I'm going to teach you this method. So I think what I get out of this is that people, and I think this happens anyway, people have to be exposed to a variety of things and get some feedback to allow them to develop themselves. And I think the feedback isn't just crits. That's feedback on the output. To develop this reflection part, which I didn't talk about here. So I would construct the educational program very differently based on what we've seen, and particularly once we include brain studies.
I think with that challenge we need to close. That's a challenge for many of us here who are educating here. I want to thank you, John, again for coming up here, and also remind you about you all who are there watching the stream or here, that there will be also next week on Thursday AI for Games talk related to creative technologies talks. So please welcome also there. But now, thank you, John, once more.
Thank you.
All right.